Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this logic model webinars for HIV prevention programs. Before we get started, I want to go ahead and give you a few housekeeping details. This presentation is scheduled to last about 45 minutes, give or take on comments and questions, but we will have an assigned time for questions and answers for the presenter at the end of the webinar. One thing that I'm going to ask to facilitate the process or to make it easier on everybody, as you notice, we have muted everyone, but please use the chat feature on your left side of the screen to ask any questions. So just go ahead and type any questions that might come up during the presentation, and I will be saving those questions to the end of the presentation. Also, one of the most frequent questions that we are asked is whether this webinar or the slides will be available. And this webinar is being recorded, and the slides as well will be available through both of our websites, ShareAction and ShareAction.org. And just to tell you a little bit about who we are, our programs are funded by the Centers for Disease Control to provide free trainings and one-on-one technical assistance for health departments as well as community-based organizations. Some of the broad areas that we have are evidence-based interventions and public health strategies, such as CRCS, testing, and so forth. Also, all the activities that you need in order to monitor and evaluate your programs, as well as any supportive organizational infrastructure and the program sustainability. So basically any type of assistance that you might need to enhance the way that you're implementing your programs or the way that you're bringing clients to your program or retaining them in your programs, we can definitely assist with that either with trainings or technical assistance. Both programs are, like I mentioned, are funded by the CDC or the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And it's a partnership between AIDS Project Los Angeles, who is collaborating with the Centers for HIV Identification, Prevention, and Treatment Services at UCLA. Our presenter today is Patrick Stanley. He began consulting for ShareAction in January 2012. He earned his BA in psychology from the University of Irvine in California, and his master's is in organizational behavior and evaluation from Claremont Graduate University. He is currently a member of the American Evaluation Association. Mr. Stanley is working with ShareAction on various projects where he's sharing his knowledge of training, organizational behavior, and evaluation theory, practice, procedures, and data analysis. His focus right now is assisting ShareActions with training, evaluation duties, and evaluation capacity building. And without further ado, I give you Patrick Stanley.
Thank you for that introduction, Oscar. So this is the introduction to logic models for HIV and AIDS programs. And just before we begin, I want to go over the objectives for this webinar to make sure everyone's on the same page. So our objectives are we want to increase your understanding of logic models, their purpose, and the terminology surrounding them, to better understand the process of developing a logic model for your own program, and to better understand how to properly utilize a logic model to benefit your program. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a good idea of what logic models are, how they're created, and how you can use them in your own programs. So this is a logic model. Logic models are defined usually as a visual layout that are designed for your program, that are designed to communicate the rationale behind your program. Logic models don't have to necessarily be designed for a program. It could be for any project that your organization is currently involved in. Logic models, typically they come in a variety of formats. Not all logic models will look like the one on the screen. And some of the words at the top of may be different. For example, resources could be called inputs in other templates you might find. You might find an additional category after outputs. There might be more outcomes. But typically, logic models are all designed in order to better fit your program so you can communicate the rationale behind what you're doing. And one of the most confusing things with logic models is a lot of people get action plans confused with logic models. Action plans typically lay out the different activities your program does. They lay out how you're supposed to do those activities, when you're supposed to do those activities, and in what manner those activities are done in. So they're really more of a guideline for how to carry out your program. Logic models take the action plan a step further and not only list the outline of all of your activities in your program, but as I mentioned before, it lists the rationale for all of those activities. So action plans are really only concerned with the first half of a logic model, and by developing a logic model, you're not only outlining what activities you're currently involved in, but also who's currently involved in your program, what are your resources, how are all of your activities and your resources linked with your outcomes and your goals that you've set for your program. And with that said, why would we want to develop the logic model? A program needs to have logic behind it for it to be effective and for us to know that the program will have a chance of working. Many programs, for example, have all of these meetings and they add and remove activities constantly. And this creates this kind of whirlwind of change that not only makes it hard to evaluate the program's actions, because if you're changing your activities constantly, it's hard to measure exactly what your impact is. But also, it can potentially endanger the program's effectiveness if you're not really sure how all of these changes you're making to this program from all these ideas that come from these meetings, how these changes relate to your outcomes or your goals that you've set for your program when you first started it. Logic models help settle the dust and create this universal definition for your program. It develops a clear idea about what your plan is, why you're doing it, and it creates an organized approach to capturing, documenting, and disseminating your program's results. One of the biggest reasons you should develop a logic model is because this creates this clear definition, this clear communication for potential funders. Funders often require a logic model to be developed for all of their grants. And because of this, if you have a really well-developed logic model, it shows to the funders that you have clearly thought out how everything your program is doing links to its outcomes, and it knows that you're committed to achieving those outcomes through the actions you've specified. Really, the phrase, "a picture is worth 1,000 words," describes the logic model clearly, because you want to be able to describe your program through the logic model in a simple picture. And just from a glance at a logic model, it should be clear to your program stakeholders, to your program staff, what you're doing and how what you're doing links in to all of your outcomes. So who should be involved in creating a logic model? I'd love to say everyone, but of course if you get everyone in a single room, it tends to be hard to get all the ideas out. And the important thing to remember is when you're developing a logic model is that the logic model needs to be a holistic view of your program. When designing it, the logic model should be comprised of all of the different perspectives of the people involved in it. So for example, the program developer probably has the best understanding of how the theory of change works for your program and how all of these activities are best linked to your outcomes. Whereas your program staff, who's been out there, who's been out in the field and worked with your population, has specific knowledge about that population or different activities that you're doing and how they actually occur in the real world. So both the program developer and all of your program staff's input is really important for a logic model. And of course, an evaluator is really important because not only are they trained in developing logic models and organizing the process for developing a logic model, but they'll know how to best link your activity and your outcomes to the evaluation plan for your own program. You can keep the process to typically 3 or 4 people, or you can even involve as many people really early on in the logic model's development process. And then you can kind of limit the people as the process goes on, and you need to start refining all of the ideas that's come out from the earlier sessions. So let's break down the logic model into the different parts that you've seen in the slide before. So first, typically, you have your inputs. And when we're talking about all these different aspects about the logic model and talking about what these items are comprised of, remember that the logic model not only should represent what your program is currently doing, but also what it should be doing to accomplish its goals. If you see that there are holes in your activities or your inputs and you don't necessarily have the resources to achieve your outcomes, you need to start thinking with your logic model about what you need to add in order to meet those outcomes. So in talking about inputs, these are sometimes called resources or some other similar term, and your inputs are comprised of everything that your program needs in order to help accomplish its goals. So examples of inputs could be your program staff, it could be your funding, it could be other organizations you're working with. All of these are great examples of inputs that you need to start thinking about when you start your logic model. The next category are often activities, and these are the actions that are included in your program. So everything you're doing or everything you need to be doing in order to meet your goals goes into this category. And all of your activities should directly lead to a planned outcome for your program. And this is why we're developing the logic model, is to develop this rationale for everything you're doing in your program. So as you're thinking about your activities, such as distributing condoms at local bars or posting awareness facts online to Twitter or Facebook, you should be thinking when you're thinking about these activities how they relate to your overall goals and outcomes. And some questions to think about when you're thinking about your activities are, what has to happen in order to make this program successful? Or what activities will ensure that your program's goals are met? After your activities come your outputs, and these are the very immediately tangible results from your activities, and they're almost always numerical or similar to a checklist. For example, from the previous example with activities, distributing condoms at local bars, you might say that an output for that is the number of condoms you distributed at these local bars. And as I mentioned before with activities, every activity should have at least one output that's currently being measured by your program. And the output section is a great place to kind of stop and look and see what you're currently tracking. Are you actually tracking how many condoms you're distributing at the local bars, or how many Facebook posts you're making for your social groups, or how many people you're testing for your program? And if you're not measuring those when you're developing the logic model, it's time to start thinking about how you can be, because these are the immediate salient checks for your program to make sure you're delivering your intended dose of your intervention to your participants. Just like you'd want to make sure in a drug test, if your participants are receiving the exact amount of drug that you're administering, you want to make sure that you're delivering enough condoms that you've specified before to your participants. You're meeting your content schedule for posting all of your awareness facts. And some questions you want to think about for your outputs is, what products are being produced by the program to help meet its goals? And again, as you can kind of see, is all of these items, all of your inputs, all of your activities, and all of your outputs link back to every other section. And it's important to think about those linkages as you develop in the logic model. After your outputs often come your outcomes. These are usually divided into at least two categories. And the first category here are your short-term outcomes. And the short-term outcomes are the immediate changes in your program's participants. And these changes could be changes in knowledge, skills, abilities, behaviors, these kinds of things. And all of these that are a direct result of your program's participants' interaction with your program. Some questions to think about for your short-term outcomes are, what are the immediate effects of this program? Or, how will we know if the program has had a positive impact? Other outcomes are your long-term outcomes, or simply impact. And these are the broader changes in your participants and community as a result of meeting all of your short-term outcomes. And these are the lofty goals that you set that seem really distant to you, but you're really always working towards these with your activities. And these are such broad things such as just increasing HIV awareness in your local community, or increasing testing rates for a local college. And sometimes you may even see more outcomes listed depending on what you're looking at for templates or other resources for logic models. And one example of these are midterm outcomes. And midterm outcomes are typically just the linkages that help make it clear how your short-term outcomes link into your long-term outcomes. And it's fine to include them or exclude them so long as you remember that your picture of your logic model, the logic model has to be a clear picture of your program, and it has to make a logical sense of, and it has to be, the logical sense has to be a clear progression from your activities, how your activities link into your outputs, how those link into your short-term outcomes, and how those link into whatever outcomes you have listed after that. And finally, as we're nearing the end of the logic model, you have your assumptions. These are what a program is assuming needs to happen or exist in order for the rest of the logic model to make sense. So some questions you might want to think about for your assumptions are, what are the principles guiding this program? Or what beliefs guide the design and implementation of the program? Or why does this program exist? For example, if you have a social media campaign that's really heavily involved in all of these social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter in order to spread your message of awareness out to your community, one of your assumptions for that program would be that your participants are currently engaged in all of those social media sites such as Facebook and Twitter. And these are important assumptions to think about. For example, I've seen with some of these programs where certain colleges tend to be more inclined towards Twitter than they are Facebook, or they're more inclined to think for more one social site for another. Or if you're passing out condoms at a local bar, they might be more inclined to meet at a certain bar than others. And these are the assumptions you want to look at for your program. And finally, you have the external factors. And the external factors are that everything beyond the program that could possibly influence it. So these are events in your community, events globally that are occurring that might possibly influence the program's design, implementation, or your outcomes. So now that we understand the different components of a logic model, let's start to think about how the logic model itself is developed. And the development of a logic model can start with something as simple as this. A program staff getting together to talk about the different components of the program and how they relate to each other. And these are simply ideas that you brainstorm on a whiteboard or on a piece of flip chart paper, and they don't even necessarily have to start as organized, so long as you're thinking about all the components of your program and how they start to link with one another. And what you kind of get is you see all of these different components, and you're trying to think about how these all funnel into that clear picture, all those different categories that we've listed before. And there are numerous ways for doing this. Some methods take a very program theory-oriented approach to developing the logic model, and they start at the ground level of the theory of change for your program. Other methodologies focus on the activities or the outcomes and branch out from those. The form of logic model creation that I'm about to talk about splits the process into two different parts. In the first phase, you want to focus, it splits into two different phases. So in the first phase, you want to focus on completely encapsulating your program in the logic model through brainstorming. You want to be able to discuss the merits of each item being added to the logic model, but in this first section, you really want to keep the focus on generating that full description of your program. Use this as a chance to organize your thoughts about the program. So you take all those little parts that you saw on the whiteboard before and organize them into those categories that we've just gone over, the inputs, the resources, the activities, the outcomes. And oftentimes, it helps to have more people involved in this first session than in the second session in order to make sure you're not leaving anything out of the logic model. Because as we discussed before, everyone has this different perspective of your program. And especially if your program has been existing for a while, every single member of your program staff is involved in your program differently, and they might have a different perspective, or they might know things about your program that might not have been aired previously. And it's important to get all these little nuances out in this first phase. So one of your goals for this first phase is to complete the rationale of your program through the logic model, even if it necessarily isn't clear or concise by this point. It's fine for your first logic model to look something like this, where you have 20 different activities, outputs and outcomes, and it doesn't look very clear. But if you look into it, if you look into each of these different aspects, everyone from that first session is sure that this really encapsulates your program, and this represents your program. And that's fine, because it's in the second phase is what you want to talk about, taking what was created in the first phase and refining it. In this second phase, you want to create the finalized product that isn't really detailed to the most minute of items. You wouldn't want to have 20 different activities, but you'd want to have a small handful of activities that represents your entire program. And in the second phase, you often do it in one of two ways. The first way is many times multiple items on your logic model will tap at the same overarching activity or outcome. So for example, again, I keep on going back to the social media example, but you might have as your activities post on Facebook, post on Twitter, post on Tumblr, and post on all these different social media sites. And what you can do with those is you can work on consolidating those items into fewer items that still communicates the overall picture. So for that, you just simply say, post on social media websites. And that gets at all those little smaller items, and you still have that previous model, so you know what all those smaller items are. But what you do with this is you create that clearer picture, and you don't need to spend as much time reading the logic model to get your point across. And other times, you may find that certain items in your logic model don't connect with the other categories. For example, you may see that your program is currently distributing condoms at local bars, when your outcomes are really just more focused on increasing testing rates in the local community. In situations like this, it's important to reevaluate those items and discuss whether or not they're essential to your program. So if you decide that you're really invested in distributing these condoms at the local bars because you really want to make sure that people have that protection, you might want to look at your outcomes and say, well, we need to add outcomes that relate to that activity. Or if you kind of decide, well, no, we really are more focused on testing, we might not really have the funding in the end to go towards that end of the spectrum, then you might want to eliminate that activity as a result of this process. So after the second phase, you might turn that previous piece of flip chart paper into something like this, which is much smaller. It taps at the same activities, outcomes, inputs, and outputs as your first, but in much, much fewer points. And it would take somebody maybe 30 seconds to a minute to read over this. And by reading something like this, they'd get a very clear idea of what your program is and why you're doing it. So these two different phases described, let's take a look at the process of developing these items within each phase. So first, oftentimes, the best place to start is by looking at your long-term outcomes, starting at the end of this logic model. And because we do this because the long-term outcomes are what should be guiding your entire program. These are the goals. These are the impacts that you want to have in your community. So whether you're seeking to increase HIV and AIDS awareness or improve testing rates, all of your inputs, activities, outputs, and short-term outcomes feed into these. So if you have a linkage to care program, you want to make sure that all of your activities really feed into linking all of these people into care. So starting with your long-term outcomes will help you make sure that all of your items in the other categories are really feeding into your long-term beliefs. So for example, with this long-term outcome, we have increased AIDS awareness in local community by the end of the program cycle. And you can see it's kind of long, but that's because we want these outcomes to be SMART. Many of us have probably heard about these SMART outcomes or SMART goals before. But just quickly to go over them, we want our outcomes to be specific. So we want the outcomes to specifically state what it's targeting. We want them to be measurable. So we want to start thinking about our evaluation when we're thinking about these outcomes, because we want to make sure that we can actually measure the impact that we're having. We want the outcomes to be action-oriented. We want to be able to make sure that we're doing something with our program. We want the outcomes to be realistic. If you have 10 different outcomes listed, and you're really invested in those 10 outcomes, you have to realize that you're committing to those 10 outcomes with your program. And if a lot of times, many programs can really only have the funding to commit to 2 or 3 outcomes due to the funding or due to the just time circumstances it takes to reach all of these different long-term outcomes. So you have to be realistic when you're developing these outcomes. And you want to make sure that you specifically state the time that you expect these outcomes to take place in. So for example, for this long-term outcome, we're just trying to increase this by the end of our program cycle, so by the end of this next year. After our long-term outcomes, we can take a look at our short-term outcomes. Discuss the more immediate changes that your program is trying to make. And when discussing these changes, make sure to keep in mind the long-term outcomes that you've just developed. Each of these short-term outcomes should directly lead to the actualization of a long-term outcome. So if we're looking to increase AIDS awareness in the local community, we'd obviously want community members to sign up to our social media programs, our social programs, social media sites. And as you can see kind of here is there's this kind of gap in logic where you see community members sign up to their social media sites leading into increasing awareness. And for this logic model, it might be good to increase a mid-term outcome that simply states that the participants will read everything you're posting to these social media sites, and they'll understand it and they'll share it. So it's important just to realize that this format is malleable and you can change it so long as you're creating this single picture that's really clear. Make sure that the time frame for your outcomes are stakeholder driven. Make sure that they're measurable. Make sure that they're supported by one or more activities. You're probably kind of sensing the theme here is that you always want everything to be linked into everything else. You want them to be measurable. You want them to be smart. And with that said, let's jump over to the inputs. Let's go back to the beginning of this and let's identify all of the resources that our program draws on and write them down. And it's not only all of the resources that your program is currently drawing on, but as we're looking at our outcomes, we want to think about what are the resources that we need to achieve our outcomes. And if we don't currently have those, what do we need to achieve? What resources do we need to secure in order to meet our outcomes that we've set? An idea for your inputs is if you have a lot of inputs, that's fine. And you can try to make your picture a lot clearer by grouping these into different types of resources, such as internal resources and external resources. And just make sure to consider all of your different kinds of resources available to your staff or to your program. After your inputs, let's jump over to activities. So with your activities, we want to think about what is your program currently doing in order to make these outcomes that we've just stated take place. So everything your program is currently doing should be placed here. So for example, for this, we have posting HIV and AIDS prevention tips to social media sites, as well as promoting the social media sites through flyers at each college. And again, all of these activities should lead to at least one short-term outcome. And if they aren't, it's time to reevaluate those activities and see whether or not they're worth keeping in. And if you're really invested in those activities, it might be time to go back and revisit your outcomes and include outcomes that those activities feed into. After your activities are your outputs. And every activity should have at least one output, because remember, these are the quick checks that you have in place to make sure your program's running as it's intended. So for posting these prevention tips, we want to keep track of how many posts each week we're making to each social media site. And if we're promoting our social media site, we want to know how many people are signing up, how many people are following us on these social media sites. And again, it's not only important to identify what each output is, but whether or not you're currently tracking that output. And this is a great time to look at these outputs and say, well, we're not tracking how many people are really following us, or how many people are reading all of our awareness tips, and start thinking about how you can measure those. So after we finish the top part of the model, let's visit our assumptions. And again, since our assumptions are everything we're assuming for the top part of the logic model makes sense, like the example I've listed before, one of our assumptions for all of this is that students are using the social media websites. And it's just important to think about what really needs to take place, or what are you really assuming that's taking place in your program's participants or in your community for all of the above to make sense. And after your assumptions are your external factors. So again, think about what are these different external factors that are happening in the world that really are working on making the top part of the logic model make sense. So for example, an external factor for this is that students have to have reliable access to the internet. It wouldn't make much sense to do a social media campaign in a very rural area where internet access isn't that available, or not a lot of people even use the internet. So that's just something important to have on your logic model so it's thought about as you're developing everything else. And finally, after you have all of the items down, you want to create the links. And you've been thinking about them the entire time you've been creating this logic model. So it shouldn't be too hard, but you want to be able to build the connection between your resources, between your activities, between your outputs, and between the target population to the short-term goals, which eventually build up to lead to those long-term outcomes. So you should be able to see from any of your activities how they link across the way into your long-term outcomes. If you find that you aren't able to visit or able to link certain activities to your outcomes, as mentioned earlier, it might be time to reevaluate those activities, as we've said before. On the other hand, if you have outcomes that don't look like they're being supported by enough inputs or activities, then you might need to include more activities in your program to really meet those outcomes by the time you've specified. Okay. So after you go through the first phase and you develop your logic model, and then you go through your second phase, probably with only a small handful of people, and you're really working at refining that logic model into that smaller picture that's a lot clearer, you want to think about how you can use this logic model. And the worst thing that can happen, and that often happens in programs, is that they put all these resources, they put all this effort into developing a really good logic model, and it sits in a binder somewhere in their office, and nobody visits it, nobody really looks at it, and it's not utilized properly. And one of the first things you want to think about with a logic model is, just like your program, the logic model needs to be organic. It needs to be constantly reviewed and revised as you look at your own program and you revise it. So as you're adding or removing program components and you have your meetings and you're talking about what you need to start doing in order to really meet your outcomes, it's important to have your logic model on hand. So every time you think about adding a new activity or even removing an activity that you're currently doing, you can look and you can see, well, if we remove this activity, then we're not going to meet one of our long-term outcomes, or our short-term outcomes aren't going to be supported enough. And you can use the logic model to frame those discussions in order to better support your program. It's also important to use your logic model to communicate your program, not only to your program staff, but also to potential stakeholders, to potential funders, because this logic model really is worth 1,000 words. With one look at this logic model, anyone should have this clear idea about your program and a clear understanding of it. And oftentimes, it's seen where your own program staff don't really have a clear idea of why they're going out and doing these surveys, or why they're going out to the end doing these events, and how they really relate to these long-term outcomes or these short-term outcomes, or just the goals, the mission statement that you've set for your program staff. And by communicating this logic model with them, you can help them better understand their own process and give them a better sense of purpose. And finally, in utilizing a logic model, you can also help develop your own evaluation with it. And this quote really, really emphasizes it, and the quote says, "The bane of evaluation is a poorly designed program, and the logic model is really the cornerstone of that program." Because with a logic model, you can communicate to your evaluator what your program is, how everything's supposedly linked, And it should be immediately visible how you can measure each of these different outcomes or measure each of these activities through your outputs. And in planning your evaluation, you should really work closely with your evaluator to develop the logic model. And if you don't have an evaluator available to your program, you can look for technical assistance, such as through Shared Action or other organizations, and get that assistance. The evaluator's assistance is really important, not only for developing the logic model, but for developing the evaluation plan based off of it. And one of the first steps you can take is, like I've mentioned before, really start thinking about how you want to begin tracking your outputs. Because at the very least, you need to be able to say that we've gone to this many people, we've distributed this many flyers, we've done this much. So you're sure that if your program's successful, it is because of all of your actions that you've accomplished. Or if your program isn't successful, it might be because your program is accidentally slacking behind on certain activities that you've stated you're doing, and you're not aware of it because you're not tracking those outputs. So again, the first steps should always be begin tracking your outputs, and then you can start jumping to the evaluation design, how you want to start measuring your outcomes, how you want to start additionally tracking your activities, and just reviewing your activities and assessing if you've met those outcomes. And so finally, when you're thinking about developing the logic model, oftentimes the first sessions are best done on a simple whiteboard, on just a sheet of paper, if that's all you have available to you, and that's fine. But as you start refining the logic model and you want to start making it a bit more sophisticated and you want to be able to distribute it to more people, it's important to think about the software you use. One of the more common specialized softwares for logic model creation is called DoView. And you can Google that or go to doview.com to look up the software. And this is just a software that's designed for creating things like logic models. It makes it very easy on you. It's very easy to use. But also a lot of the times, your own program may not be able to spend additional money or additional resources on a program like DoView. And this is why I think it's a little more important to lean more towards the simplistic programs that you already have available to yourself, such as Microsoft Word or Microsoft PowerPoint. And as you've seen before, we made just decent-looking logic models using a simple PowerPoint presentation, and it doesn't need to be a specialized program. And the important benefits of using something like PowerPoint is that anyone can edit it. You don't have to have it locked onto one computer where only one person has access to the logic model. Anyone can go onto your communal network drives, open it up, and take a look at it. And also, I mean, it's like I mentioned before, it's cheap. You probably have access to it already. You don't need to go out and secure additional resources or funding to get the program. And it's just important to realize that the free options are sometimes just the best options. And with that said, this was just an overview of logic models, a very quick run-through. Shared Action offers a half-day logic model training session that you can give to your own program staff in order to help better understand the logic model creation process. We have technical bulletins posted online on our website on logic model creation. They have a lot of this information on them. These webinar slides will be available to you online, as well as if you need more one-on-one assistance, one-on-one a technical assistance with evaluating your program or developing your program's logic model, you can contact us at Shared Action, and the information will be discussed in a tiny bit about how you can contact us, and we're available for those resources as well.
Thank you, Patrick, for this presentation. I think it's going to be very practical for a lot of the participants who are in today's webinar. I just wanted to mention a few things before we get into the question and answer. Remember that if you have any questions, to use the chat feature so that I can pose these questions to Patrick. Just a few announcements. On August 8th, we're going to be relaunching our blog forum. This is something where we capture information in a way that is more practical for you. We're looking forward to having a lot of you perhaps participate by writing some of the blogs. One example could be how you're utilizing the information that you acquire from this webinar, how you're actually applying this to your own programs. We invite you, you're probably going to get an invitation from us, but we invite you to look for this information on our website as well. One thing that Patrick was mentioning was our educational materials. This is something that you can find in our websites. Our newest materials, one of them, if you remember, we just had a webinar about this not too long ago. It was regarding the evaluation terminology, just so that all of us have a basic understanding of what is the common terminology used in evaluation. And the other one is program marketing. All of us have been involved at some point in marketing our programs for different reasons. And this is a very practical approach that you can use, or you can suggest to CBOs, if you're a health department that you're funding, on how to create their marketing components. And one more thing, I wanted to take a moment to especially thank those who are coming back to the webinars for all of your feedback that you have given us in your surveys that we sent after the webinar. Some of the topics that we have been able to identify, thanks through our topics that you want to see in coming up in webinars are prevention for positive, drug and alcohol issues in HIV, empowering MSM to change behaviors, the superinfection, harm reduction strategies, and those are some of the topics that you can look forward in upcoming webinars in the fall. As far as our upcoming webinars, we have 2 upcoming webinars. One of them is the Linkage to Care webinar, and you got the information on the previous flyer, but we'll be sending this information out again. And this will be taking place on August 16 at 11 o'clock Pacific Standard Time or 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. So with that said, those are all the announcements that I have. I encourage you to use the chat feature to ask any questions you might have regarding the logic model topic. And to start with, I do have a few questions that came in, Patrick. One of them, you start talking about logic models, and the question is, when is a good time to start developing a logic model?
That's a great question. Oftentimes, the best time to start a logic model is when you're creating your program. And when you have that theory of change developed for your program, it's important to have this logic model as this good cornerstone for determining what activities you need to accomplish or what activities you need to do in order to meet those goals and implement this change in your community. With that said, oftentimes this isn't the case and a logic model can get overlooked, and my response to that is the best time to start is now. Wherever you are at in your program, if you don't have a good logic model developed, get people together, develop a logic model, and see what comes out of it, because what will happen is as you're developing this logic model, everyone involved in the process, all of your staff, are going to get a better, much more clearer picture of your program, how all of its activities are linked to all of your goals that you've been pushing towards to. And it'll be very beneficial to your program to start it as soon as possible.
And we have a couple of clarifying questions. The first one is, it's still not that clear how assumptions tie into the top part of the logic model.
Okay. So, for example, as I kept on referring back to you before, let's take the example of an awareness campaign. And this awareness campaign focuses on just distributing flyers through local colleges. One of the underlying assumptions then would be that if we're handing out these flyers to these students, the students are going to read the flyers. And that's a really important assumption to make. And it might just seem something like that you just innately know, like, well, of course, if they're not going to read the flyers, we're not really going to make progress towards our outcomes. But it's important to have this written down because you want to think about it as you're developing the flyers. And if you notice, if the people distributing the flyers notice that, say, for example, that the second they hand out the flyer, it goes in the trash can 2 feet away, it might be time to look at the flyer design. It might be time to poll the local students and see why are they throwing the flyers away? What would make them more interested in them? And that's how the assumptions really tie into the rest of the logic model. These are just kind of the underlying assumptions that you may take for granted, but are really important to think about as you're developing your program and as you're developing your activities.
Thank you. And the second question, a clarifying question is, a lot of people are in the middle of implementing the programs, or those who are going to be implementing programs. Where does funding fit in within within the logic model, where should it go? Inputs, external factors, what portion should funding go?
Funding can be an external factor. It's definitely an input. It's definitely a resource that's available to you. And when you put something like funding down, you want to be able to identify, well, these are the different contracts we have. These are the different sources of funding we have. These are when they're going to run out. These are when our program cycles are ending and when our funding cycles are ending. And those are important to have in the logic model because they frame, well, we need to make sure that we're meeting our outcomes and we have them evaluated and we can say something about our program by this time. But they can also definitely be an external factor because as we've all known for the last probably half decade now is that funding is drying up. It's becoming increasingly hard to get. And it's an external factor because you have to know that your program is good. You have to be able to clearly communicate your program in order to secure that funding. And of course, by developing this logic model, you're really able to say to your funders, we've thought about this. We know that there are a lot of other people competing for these sources of funding, but we've put this time, we've put this thought into our program, and we know that everything we're doing really links in to what our goals are and our mission for our program.
Yeah, and some of the things is that logic models are now not necessarily an optional thing. Some of the FOAs or some of the RFPs or proposals are requiring that you do submit a logic model so that they can have a glance over what are you projecting your program to be. In addition to the programs that Patrick mentioned, such as Word or PowerPoint, some of the funders provide an example of what they want the logic model to look like or some of the templates in order for you to use that and visualize how you can put all of your program design into this. Now, with that said, we have all of these tools. We know how a logic model works. How do we take that piece of paper per se and make it into a mode of thinking? How do we take it from conceptual to practical?
It's really about keeping the logic model in mind as you have meetings, as you talk about your program with outside staff, and this can be done in a variety of ways. If you feel you want to put a 44 by 44 poster of your logic model up in your meeting room so it's always on your mind as you're meeting and you're talking about what today's duties are or what you're looking forward to in the future, that's a great idea. And it's about being innovative and about being able to just remember the logic model. And definitely, as I had mentioned before, once it's created, make sure everyone knows it, everyone has a copy of it, everyone is aware of it, and that it just doesn't get forgotten somewhere in your file folders on your computer or in a binder in your desk. That's the worst possible thing that can happen with the logic model is that you put all that time and effort into it and you end up not using it. So think about it with your staff. Try and distribute it as much as possible, make people aware of it, and just see what works for you.
Thank you, and I think I want to emphasize on the last part, which is having the staff understand the logic model. I think this is one of the ways that staff gets buy-in into how the program is being run or why certain activities are conducted. There's a logic behind that, and this is another way that once they understand that, they will be able to perhaps more productively and effectively understand why the activities are happening. Now, another question that has come in is, so what happens if my logic model shows that the outcomes we want don't connect to the activities that we are doing?
If that happens, then it really is time to reevaluate either what you're doing or what your outcomes are. And usually, more often than not, it's easier to look at what you're doing than what your outcomes are, because oftentimes you've committed to your funders. You've committed to the people funding your program that you're going to be doing and you're going to be achieving these goals, you're going to be achieving these outcomes. And it's really hard to change those. So in situations like that where you're bound to completing these outcomes, you want to look at your activities. And if you develop your logic model and you see that the worst case scenario is nothing you're doing is really linking into these outcomes, you want to start, it's time to get a meeting together with your program staff and start to think about how to fix it. how can you alter these activities either to fit into meeting those outcomes, or how can you start implementing new activities and replacing the old ones in order to better meet those outcomes?
And now I have a couple of questions about what to include in a logic model. Do we have to include specific numbers to achieve in a logic model?
It's better often than not. So if, for example, you mean by including numbers that you, pardon me. So for your outcomes, if you want to include for just like what time you want it to be completed by, that's great. For your outputs, if you want to include, say, for if one of your activities is distributing flyers, you say, well, we want to distribute 400 flyers. You can say, well, how many out of 400 flyers have we distributed by the end of this month or by the end of this program cycle? It's always important, though, to balance the design of your logic model with the amount of information you put into it. So if your if your logic model is very light and you can fit in all of those numbers, all those expectations, and you can make it look good, great, go in and go ahead and do it. But if it's going to end up making the the logic model too cluttered, and if it'll just convolute the logic model too much, it might be best to just kind of keep those as assumptions or keep those in as a separate logic model, one that's a little more detailed and you can refer back to if you're really curious about, well, how many did we really commit to? How many flyers did we commit to? Or how many, or by what time did we commit to meeting the short-term outcome? And then keep the more simplistic one for communicating your program to other people, to other program staff, to other stakeholders or funders.
Again, and thank you for the questions everybody has posted. Before I go and ask the following two questions, I want to remind our participants that at any point, whether it is developing, whether it is reviewing, whether it is you need assistance in understanding and reviewing what a logic model is, you can always contact us for our services, which are free, and we can talk to you about how to request our services. You have my contact information on the slide, on the current slide, so you can access our information. Now, we have two more questions. The other question, once again, is about inclusion. Do I need to put my evaluation activities into the logic model along with programmatic activities, or should that be a separate logic model?
Your evaluation activities will feed into your evaluation plan and your evaluation design, and they don't necessarily go into your logic model. The logic model more focuses on what your program is and what your program is currently doing. And the evaluation supplements that through a separate document or through a separate chart or however your evaluation team wants to plot it out. But limit your logic model to simply what your program is currently doing and what it's currently involved in, or what it needs to be involved in order to meet your outcomes.
Okay, and are there any limitations in using a logic model?
No, not really. I mean, the limitations of using the logic model are simply how often you intend to use it, or just how aware you make people of it. The logic model, like I said, is can be a cornerstone for your program. It can be a great foundation for supplementing it with another program, supplementing your current outcomes with other activities. And so, no, I really wouldn't say there aren't any limitations for using the logic model. Use it as you see fit and use it as you need in order to help better communicate your program and better run your own program.
And as I mentioned, if you have any needs in us reviewing your logic model, or you would like assistance with it, please by any means do contact us. I believe that was the last question. I'm going to give one more minute for any pending questions that you all might have. I want to remind you that this webinar has been recorded and will be posted on our websites, www.shareaction.org and www.shareactionhd.org. And I also want to encourage you to participate in the blog forums, which should be launched by August 8th with numerous topics such as this one. So since there are no more questions, I want to thank all of you for participating today. And we hope to see you next time in our next webinar. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Please stand by.